It's time to analyze our most recent Zero RB Best Ball draft over at Underdog Fantasy. We drafted in the Little Big Board too, and we're going to dive back into some questions that myself and Shawn, I'm sure, have for each other, but the listeners will be having based on how we drafted that team from the 6th spot and how that team played out in general. So we're going to talk through all of that. There's a number of picks. When you're picking in the middle of the draft, there's always that little bit of a question because there's 12 picks between each pick. Do I stretch and go around ahead of ADP? Do I try and play the ADP game? How will we let the draft fall? And there's lots of things that we get to talk back about this particular draft. So Shawn, before we get into the team, how are you feeling post draft? It's always nice to let the wheels off and get one of those zero RB drafts in the books.
Yeah, I love the zero RB nature of this squad. And yet, I always say it's virtually impossible to come out of a draft and not like it if A, you were prepared in terms of understanding which players that you like. And obviously we spend a lot of time with it, so we know which players that we like. B, you understand structurally what you need to accomplish. And then C, you go ahead and take fun players and enjoy it. And how do you come up with a team that you don't like in that context? Because you are prepared to put together not just a team that has the elements of a winning franchise, but one that is fun and you're excited to root for all season. Having said that, Colm, this probably is the closest to a team that I don't care for as we can get, in part because I do think that my recommendation of going ahead and grabbing Joe Burrow in round 7 really sort of sabotage some of the other things that we could have potentially done. This was also kind of an interesting case where the draft didn't fall to us the way we wanted. We just have to be straightforward about that. Being in the middle, I mentioned at the start of the show, usually has a lot of benefits to you as a drafter. You can get these values as they fall. You're not on a lot of pressure to reach. That was also not the case, right? The players we were looking to fall didn't. In many cases, the guys we were looking at were picked right ahead of us. We did then end up having to grab a few guys ahead of ADP in order to accomplish our specific objectives. So I wouldn't say that this is one of my favorite drafts, but I think it's a very interesting draft. And if the question is, do I think the team will still work and does it have upside to win the contest? I'm definitely still on board with this roster from that perspective.
Yeah, so a couple of things you mentioned there, and the draft will fall in different directions, but this one, there was a couple of times where we had to pivot, where maybe two of the players that we were hoping to get both went picks before us, for example, and that puts you in a little bit of a challenge. So some of the decisions as we talk through them here will be based on that. But Shawn, the other thing with this team, you mentioned, drafting players you like. This team now, looking back at it, with the draft being over, it is filled with either rookies, second-year players that we had pretty solid or very good rookie seasons, and then we also have some of our absolute favorites that maybe we just can't give up on, and that's the likes of a T. Higgins, for example. But I think this team has a lot of interesting aspects, and people will look at it with particularly the running back position, as you will with a team after a zero RB draft. And this one, I think, got a little bit thinner in terms of our potential pathways, I guess. But the thing is, in this draft with the 20 roster spots, it is going to allow you those extra 2 picks, which is going to then allow you to take some upside shots. And I think pre-NFL draft, my way that I would like to play that is through the rookies rather than, taking, especially in those last 2 rounds, taking veterans that, you mentioned this at the end of the last show, where after the NFL draft, those guys will probably be completely undraftable based on what the NFL teams take in around those veterans that I mentioned. So as we look through it, I think we take the first half of the draft and then we obviously can talk about the back, because a lot of what we did on the back end was kind of forced by what we did on the front end. So from the 106, we take Amon-Ra St. Brown. Then in the second round, we take Drake London. We had a little bit of a conversation during the draft about Marvin Harrison versus London. Harrison did go 1 pick before. I mentioned I would still rather go the London route. I think Shawn is more towards the Harrison side of things, but it is a little bit of a tricky spot when you get to the back end of that second round with the players going. It's it feels a little bit funny that when you move in then to rounds 3 through 5, it feels like there's more names of intrigue. We go Sam Laporta in the third round, then T. Higgins, Jaden Reed, Jordan Addison. I think the first pick, Shawn, that really came into focus in terms of what we would do, we had the option to go between T. Higgins and Zay Flowers. I think that's fair to go Higgins. If people wanted to go Flowers there, that's also fair. But the next one then was we took Jaden Reed. We were kind of looking at, him versus Kenneth Walker. And I was hoping that Walker may have got back around to us. But we also had in the queue at that time Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts. All of those players went on the wraparound and were all gone before it got back to us. So that was the first point where I think, although I did mention to you I wanted to have 4 wide receivers or 4 pass catchers, adding in Sam Laporta through those opening 5 rounds, I would have been open there to pivoting to Kenneth Walker. He's the first running back that I really have a strong interest in once you go outside of that first round, I think, at their ADPs and the players that are available. So that's the first one to look at, which then led us to go with Jordan Addison, which means then we have 5 wide receivers, 1 tight end through those opening 6 rounds. And that's not something that is going to affect, but that first decision, I think, is where then we look through some of the other decisions after. So in hindsight, just as far as that 6th round, I guess, I think I probably would change Reed out based on the hindsight of knowing what happened at the running back position after, because a lot of the targets that you'd be interested in, even the likes of a Mostert, Raheem Mostert, that is, maybe even Javonte Williams, Brian Robinson, Zamir White. We did touch on Austin Eckler a little bit later, but Tajay Spears, Jonathan Brooks, they were other players later on. I think the first thing that started to put that little bit of pressure on the running back situation was passing on Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker versus Jaden Reed, which would you... I always love to ask you this question. In a solo draft, which one does Shawn Siegele draft?
I might have taken Kenneth Walker because I am a big fan. I do think that the Seattle offense is going to be more dynamic this season. And yet, I guess I'm not that upset this year if you miss on Walker in favor of getting Charbonnet later. Now, I know that there are going to be some big Charbonnet fans who are disappointed by how he played last year, or at least the opportunities he got within the context of that offense, and feel that doesn't actually knock down the thesis for him. And so there's less reason to be excited this year than there was last year. For me, Charbonnet did a lot of what you would reasonably expect. I mean, he did what I thought he was going to do. And now that you have 2 backs who were drafted to be sort of co-starters, now that they're both veterans, I think that this gap between Walker and Charbonnet that we saw last year in terms of how the coaching staff was wanting to play it potentially is going to be a little bit less. Obviously, we've got a new coaching staff there as well. So,
and obviously they could draft a running back next week and then that changes it as well. But if, for example, I would fully expect if they didn't take a running back, let's say in the first 4 rounds, that Charbonnet's value starts to creep up from where it was, because he has taken a significant, I would say a two round discount from where he would have been going last year.
Yeah, and I guess this year I have the guys closer together than I did last year. And so for me, when we end up going and getting Charbonnet in round 11, I have him ranked at the end of round 9. That's a pretty good fit for me. So again, I think that Walker is the bigger talent. I think he has more upside. I think that his price makes sense, and he's a good target here because he should probably also be more expensive. When I'm looking at my own rankings, and I have Jaden Reed in the middle of round 4, about a round ahead of Kincaid and Walker and Pitts. So at least from that perspective as well, I mean, this selection that we made is the one that I think you probably want to be targeting. Jaden Reed in round 5 looks like a pretty big bargain. Now, are there scenarios in which Christian Watson kind of re-breaks out or has a secondary breakout? Are there situations where Romeo Doubs or Dontavian Wicks or even some of the deeper guys that we saw also, look very effective? They've got a couple of tight ends in Musgrave and Kraft. Could it end up being a situation that is, so unconcentrated that Reed ends up being like a mini bust there, even if he stays healthy? Then yes. On the other hand, he just looks more electric, more dynamic than the rest of the pass catchers in that offense. I mean, you need a situation where Christian Watson stays healthy, and he's an interesting guy because some of these teams and players, the guy continues to have the same problems forever, and you really wonder, what they're doing to address it. Now, in many cases, they are addressing it. It's just not public information, right? But with Watson, we know that they've done a ton of work to try and figure out these soft tissue injuries and to try and fix them. Now, whether or not the fix actually works is kind of a separate story there. When you're talking about Reed in 5 versus Watson in 7, I'd still very much prefer to be on the Reed side of that. So I like that pick, and I especially like the pick in light of the fact that JSN didn't get to us in round 7. If he gets to us in round 7, so it's really just one more pick, then we select him instead of Joe Burrow. We don't have the Burrow pick in there, which, as I mentioned, I do think kind of screws things up. And now you have 6 receivers in the first 7 rounds, which we know that will work, and yet it may be a little bit of a luxury pick in which you would go back and say, yeah, now I wish we had taken Walker. But since we didn't get that chance, I think having the 5 wide receivers early and then going with 7 with Mims and Robinson late. And one of the things that you see here in this draft for me is that from round 7 to, about where we took Mims in round 14, I don't like the other wide receiver options that we got at the prices that they were available at. And so I think I like the way that worked there. The main thing for me is that I would have preferred, I say that, but Jordan Addison is massively undervalued as well. So for him actually being the pick that we didn't want to make in round 6 because we wanted it to be either Walker or one of these tight ends, if you get forced into Jordan Addison in round 6, then you're like, well, that's fine. I mean, that's a fantastic pick at that spot. The quarterback play will have to be really, really bad. And that's possible that it will be, but it'll have to be really, really bad for Jordan Addison not to be an absolute smash in the middle of round 6. So Colm, I think through 6 rounds there, it's almost the perfect draft for me. One of the things I was going to say is, when we pick Drake London, I have Olave and Neighbors and Waddle as also being values, but that's within the context of also having London as the overall player 14, right? So the overall sort of 202. I mentioned that I didn't really like him in the middle of round 2, but he is actually still a rankings value at that point. So again, it's just you kind of want there to be an extremely exciting pick there. I don't know that there is. I'd be comfortable.
But I think that's part of that.
Waddle. You've got guys.
I think that's kind of part of the discussion there. But interesting when you talk like the Reed play. I think is very interesting. And when we go back to, I always say one of my favorite shows every year is when you and Ben do projecting the first 2 rounds of the future years fantasy drafts, and like Reed and Addison for me. Addison, maybe it'll be a little bit trickier with the quarterback change, but I could see a case where, we see Reed push himself up towards that, because we're going to see a number of those guys age out of those first 3 rounds in particular. It may, I always joke it'll never happen with Mike Evans at this rate, but you have Evans, Kupp, Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, Stephon Diggs, all in that range. Devontae Adams goes in the early second round in this draft. So there is going to be room for people to grow and move up in ADP as well as with their NFL performance. So I think Reed could be in that situation. I think Addison could be if the quarterback fit is right. And obviously you have a situation where TJ Hawkinson isn't likely to be available for a good portion, I would imagine, of the season. His recovery, that's going to open up opportunities as well for Addison and that side of things with the targets and so on. So we're kind of settled, and be nice to have Kenneth Walker, but it's okay not to have him based on then later we got Charbonnet and how things have played out there. Still would enjoy having him on the roster, but it's kind of that thing of like you have to take somebody out to fit somebody in. But we move in then to the next portion of the draft, which is in round 7. We go Joe Burrow to pair with T. Higgins. Then it's Warren, Jared Goff, Dallas Goedert, Zach Charbonnet, Jalen Wright, Marshawn Lloyd, Marvin Mims. So that's through 14 rounds. So I guess the next pivot point or question point is, in round 7, we're 1 pick away from getting JSN, who would have been our preferred pick. You mentioned that, Joe Burrow, it may have affected how the rest of the draft then played out at that particular point. But when we looked through the names, we did talk about some of the tight ends. Brock Bowers was somebody who also went 2 picks ahead, so 1 pick ahead of JSN that we would have liked to get on this roster at that particular moment in time. But the players then that went after him are Jordan Love, Hopkins, Evan Ingram, who we had added to our queue, Watson, Kyler Murray, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Mostert, Ferguson, Pollard, Mike Williams, and then Nick Chubb before we take Warren. So I guess we can say that, it would be nice to get JSN or Bowers, but that's not an option because they're gone. But in that list of players that are available there, who are you looking at particularly? If I was looking at picking in that list, I'm looking at Mostert or Swift. Which names are you looking at? Because we're then hopefully getting Warren still at pick 91.
Yeah, this is an area where, even though it's still fairly early in the draft, it's kind of this drafting from back to front mentality where you need to be looking at 2 rounds together. And we went ahead and took Burrow in part because we were pretty confident that we would get a back that we wanted in round 8. But the problem right now is that the ADPs for the interesting running backs are pretty tied together, where we have Stevenson and Mostert at the end of round 7. You have Harris and Swift and Warren in the first half of round 8. Nick Chubb is interesting because he's going to be a dominant force when he gets back in all likelihood. There's uncertainty there with the injury, and there's not much optimism that he'll be ready for the start of the season. But then you have Javonte Williams at the end of round 8. And it's really those guys that you want to load up on. And so when you're in the middle of round 7, you're maybe thinking, well, I don't want to reach from an ADP perspective. But if you don't, then you're not going to get 2 of the guys. And I contrast the prices with my rankings. And I know that a lot of listeners will be like, Shawn probably has these guys ranked well below ADP because they're running backs, but it's not really the case, right? I have Warren and Stevenson, Mostert and Williams. That's Javonte Williams, all ranked as round 6 values. So when you're staring at them in round 7 and you're trying to put 2 of them onto your roster, certainly drafting 1 in round 7 and 1 in round 8 is a very viable approach. That's something we didn't do, and I do think it came back to haunt us.
Yeah, I think we just got a little bit, it's one of those things. I don't know if it was this pick or a different pick, but you mentioned about doing these drafts as podcasts. It does mean that we're trying to communicate back and forth and give thoughts on players and give thoughts on strategy. And sometimes it does get to a situation where, Bowers, JSN go off the board and the options then maybe aren't as appealing. You have to make that decision, quickly. And you're trying to make a decision that I'm trying to get. And we're trying to kind of read each other's minds over the wonders of the internet. But I think in hindsight, having one of those options would have been ideal to pair then with Warren at that particular time. And again, a little bit of that is also, you're mentioning the rankings, which is obviously not in hindsight, that's planned out and how you want the drafts to play out. But I was kind of thinking at that point of the draft, some of these running backs are going to move towards us. And maybe that was a little bit too optimistic of me, thinking that the draft's going to play out exactly how you want it to. And this is a good one to have recorded and talked through because it'll give insights to people who are drafting and the draft doesn't fall to them, or maybe they're listening and they think the guys are always saying that it's going the way they want it to, and that it's interesting to get the different elements. But after that, having taken Joe Burrow, and obviously we have Goff because we have the 2 Lions on the roster. Goff ADP is 1 round later than we take him, and we take him at that point. So I would have been more of the mindset potentially there if I was drafting solo that if we get Burrow, that we try and let Goff go to ADP. Or I would have passed on Burrow and then take Goff at the pick ahead of ADP, if that makes sense. So because we have a quarterback, I would let him potentially fall that round. And if we didn't have him, I would have took him earlier. But when we go then, we get Warren, and then we go Goff, and then we go Goddard. So this was a period of kind of 4 picks where I think the draft was really determined in terms of how things went. When we did draft Goff at that pick, we did also have a run on some of the running backs that we would have wanted. So when we take Jalen Warren, we're kind of hoping that maybe Benson or Williams gets back to us, even maybe Zamir White. But the other player I mentioned was Austin Eckler, who at the time when you were talking about him, I was thinking, are we going back to Austin Eckler 0 RB? Back to the good old days. But in this situation, we take Jared Goff. Was, the down part of the Jared Goff pick is that Jonathan Brooks and Tyjae Spears also go in the kind of 5 picks after, and then Chase Brown goes 1 pick ahead of the Dallas Goedert pick. So between when we picked Warren and when we picked Goddard, a lot of our prime targets, basically all, I mentioned at one part of the draft, all the running backs coming up in 8 through 12 kind of, and basically all those guys nearly went off the board in those 2 rounds between when we picked. So that was an area where the draft did get a little bit difficult for us.
Yeah, and this goes back to trying to balance or juggle multiple objectives, because the other back who really complicated what happened for us here is Trey Benson. He's someone I have ranked in round 7, and his ADP is about our pick in round 9. But he goes with the first pick in round 9, doesn't get back to us. And so this is an element where, I mean, in round 8, we're obviously going to take Warren and not Benson, but we're banking on the fact that Benson has certainly not a 100% chance, but a decent chance to get back to us. And we don't necessarily want to draft him a lot ahead of that spot anyway, because we know we're going to have a decent exposure, and you want the exposure to be at a reasonable cost. And so you're looking for him to get back, but he doesn't. And then the next couple of picks, and the reason that we took Goff there was not because we wanted to make sure we got him. It was because we were going to go ahead and let some of these running backs go through again to give us a little more chance to build out the team, think about how we wanted that to work, and to not end up with the exposure that we have to certain guys be at prices that don't necessarily work. So Spears is a player I have ranked in the first half of round 8, certainly in round 9, he would have worked fine for us, but we're looking at the ADPs for Spears and Jonathan Brooks and thinking that they work better in round 10. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that I do encourage people to do, especially if you're not going to draft like 150 times, and if you're going to draft to, completely fill out your max entries and not just say, the big board, but the little board, but also BBM, all those kinds of things. I mean, that I love, that's awesome. Certainly we're not pushing people to do that. If you're going to draft 10 times, that's a really fun way to play it as well. If you're going to draft 10 times, make sure you get out there and get the guys that you want and draft them by your rankings as opposed to ADP. The emphasis on ADP and getting ADP values is overstated. It's not meaningless, but you need to make sure you build rosters that work and fit, and you come out of the draft and that you like, right? So that's the main thing that I want to point out here in a draft where one of the reasons that we have some picks that we're not as fond of is because we are trying to manage some ADP related types of things. And it's a good reminder of how that can cause you problems. The Dallas Goedert pick is a similar one where I have him ranked well below Cole Kmet. But if you're going to draft exclusively off of the rankings, then you're going to end up with 0% Dallas Goedert and, a percentage of Kmet that maybe is above where you really want to be. This was a spot where we could get that Goedert exposure. And that only happened because Chase Brown also went a little bit ahead of where we were looking at him. Again, where he went related to the rankings would have been perfectly fine. Yeah. So that's something, again, we want to be aware of not losing, especially a bunch of guys in one draft who would have been good values by the rankings but weren't by ADP, because then you end up with a team here where like now, we've got to struggle to kind of fill in. But Colm, I like the guys that we did end up with, and the guys that we ended up with are also players, not surprisingly, because you're drafting off of your own rankings, but not surprisingly, they're also players that we got at value to where I have them ranked.
Yeah, and the other thing on this is I mentioned, Spears, Brooks, Benson, Williams, Chase Brown, who you mentioned again, one pick before the Dallas Goedert selection. The other player that I was kind of thinking when we take Goddard there that I would have liked to potentially draft, but we were also in the situation where we needed a second tight end at that particular point. But Chuba Hubbard went at the 11:01, which, before we get back to Charbonnet, we talked about Charbonnet already, but he would be somebody that I'd be trying to fill out these rosters. I do think, Shawn, out of any 0RB draft that we've probably ever done together, I think that, the targets, and maybe that's because we're in the middle of the rounds, were kind of very spread out and weren't getting back to us, which thankfully it usually works the opposite way. We moved down then to Charbonnet, who we talked about, then Wright, then Marshawn Lloyd, so getting those rookies in there, Marvin Mims, Wendell Robinson, we talked about them kind of on the show as well, adding to the depth of the already taken 5 wide receivers at the very start of the draft, and that gives us the 7 wide receivers at that point. But also that means that, in that range from round basically 6 through round 14, we don't take any wide receivers in that range, but still have some potential targets beyond that. And then we do kind of finish out the draft, Shawn, with mainly all rookies. And I mentioned when we were, drafting, that looking to get the rookies now before the NFL draft. And some of these guys will fall in value. Some of them may go undrafted in the NFL draft, which will cause them to fall out of these drafts as well. But you're also looking at situations where, potential landing spots, potential draft capital, there's all those sort of things that will help. And this is kind of the last week where you're going to have that opportunity to see those jumps happen, in a very positive way, but also potentially negative. But we have a lot of rookies on this roster, and we like to do that. So you're going to be better than me at talking through these running back options. But how do you feel with how the running backs kind of filtered out from that first pick of Warren, which I'm confident in, I think we're both confident in, but then when we move down beyond the Charbonnet pick through, Jalen Wright, all the way through Isaiah Davis, who was our final selection in the 20th round?
Yeah, so we mentioned getting some rankings values as we move through. Charbonnet, a round 9 ranked player, we got in round 11. Wright and Lloyd are both ranked in round 10, and they go to us in rounds 12 and 13. Marvin Mims and Wan'Dale Robinson, players we're going to get a lot of probably. Those players are ranked multiple rounds ahead of where we got them. It gets a little bit trickier as we get to the end when we're looking at Bucky Irving, Estime, Abanikanda, and Davis. You have the 5 rookie running backs there and then an unproven second-year player, and you mix that in also with the rookie tight end. One of the issues that this roster almost inevitably will have is that it's going to have some holes in it, because not all of those guys are going to end up in situations that work. And so you're going to be balancing out the likelihood that a few of your guys jump with the problems that you get from having the holes. I think with the 20 rounds, that's a little bit more manageable. But as you're working through it, one of the reasons to have balanced it a little bit better early is so that you don't have to take the extreme level of risk, which can wipe out your roster even when you have the hits. And so that part, I think, is a little bit problematic. But again, as we mentioned on the first show, Bucky Irving's peripherals are pretty extraordinary. Estimate somebody who I think is going to be drafted a little bit earlier than the perception right now. Isaiah Davis, another player with just a lot of work and interesting numbers on a per play basis in terms of his ability to punish defenders, to break tackles, all of that kind of thing. So when you mix that in with somebody like Ben Sinnott, who I think is almost a lock to be a big riser, somebody who, barring the absolute worst case scenario, is going to rise into that round 13, 14 range as we move through draft season. You do have a lot of built-in value there. And Colin, one of the reasons that we kind of get to where we were early, but don't push it beyond that. Now, I mentioned I didn't think that wide receivers were really an option, but as long as the draft is going to give us Marvin Mims in round 14, it's going to give us Wan'Dale Robinson in round 15, I think that we have to take advantage of that with a lot of shares. That doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work. Those are still players who have pretty close to zero as one of the more likely outcomes for them. But the upside is just absolutely through the roof. The other player who I think would have been interesting to mix in here, when we took Bucky Irving, we were kind of hoping that Tez Walker would get back to us in round 17. He doesn't. He goes at the 17:03. A player that we had also sort of mentioned as a possibility there. We could have taken Jalen Hyatt, and then we would have hoped that Daniel Jones got back around to us in round 18, but he did not. And so that probably, works out for us fine, because we needed all of those running backs. We're going to need one of these rookies to do something that drafters are certainly not factoring in as very likely if this team is going to A, win the league, and then B, go on and make noise in the tournament.
Yeah, so a lot of fun to recap the team. It was a lot of fun drafting the team. And I hope people, have enjoyed listening in, and give us your thoughts. Let us know maybe who the best or worst pick off the draft was. But always a lot of fun drafting along with Shawn. So hopefully you've enjoyed our kind of recap of it, but also the draft in general. If you haven't checked that out yet, it is already available on the Rotoviz Overtime podcast feed. I meant to mention at the start of the draft, Shawn, when we started it all off, that I have had a few people reach out about doing some drafts, listener leagues over at the FFPC. They have a number of contests up and running now. So if you are interested in drafting along with myself and Shawn Siegele, drop me a line on Rotoviz radio@gmail.com, or send it across on Twitter @OvertimeIreland. We'll try and get some of those set up over the course of the offseason, but post-NFL draft might be a fun time to get one of those up and running. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter @OvertimeIreland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.